My big idea. So that's the big idea. Oh yes, that's right. It's doing the like then I was like, it's a bad idea. It's like some of the they got better. But I'm like when I designed this, like basically one of them. It's 35. So, and I didn't understand why that kind of I didn't
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Professor Botond Bognar, whose work has had a huge impact on me professionally and personally. It was back in 1998 when I was working on my MArch thesis, like many of you, designing the Japanese Cultural Center in Isfahan, Iran, that I first came across his writings on contemporary Japanese architecture. I quickly fell in love with his insightful take on the subject. It became a source of inspiration that stuck with me throughout my PhD and beyond, even though my own research went in a totally different direction. After my graduation, when I was editing an architectural journal, Botond contributed alongside legendary figures like Charles Jenks and Philippe Jodidieu, which was an incredible honor. And when I first visited Japan in 2003, I had his Japan guide. Just trying to show you the cover here, which I had his Japan guide in my hands. It helped me not just navigate the country, but also gave me a deeper appreciation of the architecture I was experiencing. For those of you who will be going there, make sure that you get an updated version that is going to be published next year. Now for a quick background on our distinguished guest. Born and educated in Budapest, Hungary, Professor Bognar is currently the Edgar A. Tafel Endowed Chair in Architecture at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, where he has been teaching for 40 years. He holds degrees from the Budapest University of Technology and the University of California, Los Angeles, and conducted research at the Tokyo Institute of Technology as a Japanese governmental scholar. As a licensed architect, he has worked in both Hungary and Japan, where he lived for many years. Professor Bognar is an internationally known scholar of Japanese architecture with over 20 books and monographs to his name, along with countless essays and articles. He has lectured all over the world, including at prestigious institutions like the University of Tokyo, the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and leading universities across Europe, Asia, Australia, and the US. He is also now finalizing his latest book, Modern Architectures in History, Japan. Professor Bognar is without a doubt the leading scholar on Japanese architecture, and his work has inspired countless scholars and architects worldwide. What's really inspiring about him is that he sees himself simply as an admirer of architecture who loves writing about it. And I think that's something we can all learn from. We are really honored to have you here, and please join me in welcoming Professor Botond Bognar.
Have the switch on here, which is on white. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Mohammed, for this wonderful introduction. And it is a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And you just reminded me, which I didn't even know, that you were working on your thesis. My last memory of our interaction was the Abadi, which was 22 years ago, if I am right, when I contributed to your journal. And it's, of course, a great pleasure to be back here and see you and the school here. And it's, of course, always a great pleasure to see you. I don't know how many of you are here who participated in this minuscule charrette. It was a little bit of, how should I say, deprivation of your intention, but I hope that you can continue along those lines. Now, going back to this guidebook, which I have just seen, it's a 1997 book, which quite clearly is really outdated. It's not sold anymore unless you get somewhere on the internet. However, there is a new one published now, not in New York, but in Berlin, Dome Publishers. It's Japan, it's Architectural Guide Japan. This will be the third edition, and why? Because I was rushed to update the book, because next year in Osaka, the new expo will open April 16. And anticipating a large crowd, the publisher wanted to have this book out. Now, I can recommend to those who, well, want to go to Japan especially, or you are interested in Japanese architecture. This is a guidebook which features 700 buildings with 1,000 color photos and so on. It's a good introduction. But I'd like to today talk about something which is fortunately an emerging and ongoing process. Today in Japan, the Japanese architects keep me busy as they are busy. I am following up the contemporary scenario, so it's an ongoing one, like the light and shade goes on your walls, right? Like Ando does it, comes back. It's an ongoing process. So I'd like to go to the subject here, and if I am able to forward it, okay, right here. Well, I'd like to start with something which we are all part of or experiencing. Today we live in a very troubled world in many ways. Politically, well, perhaps even economically, wars, globalization, and so many other things troubles the world. Today I will be interested in the issue with which we have lost touch with nature. And I could say that in general terms, but in more concrete terms, architecture. And what I would like to talk about how this new trend, if that's the good word, is coming about today, perhaps not just in Japan, but today we will limit it to Japan. Well, here, of course, you can see how the Earth is warming. No matter what some others say that this is a hoax, we are destroying at the moment our own environment. So let's see what, if at all, architecture can do. Japan has not been innocent in this process, particularly in the rush of modernization after the Second World War. It goes back even before the war, but particularly after the Second World War. It was which was called the Japanese miracle. It was an industrialization of the country, but it was not without a huge price. You can see the environment, all of the photographs are mine. So in the past 51 years, I have been around, and many of them have been taken from helicopters and so on. But here it is. This is the congestion, what Tokyo is. This is a photograph on the right side, 1974, when the electronic display here. Where is this? Whoops. Here, displayed the carbon monoxide and so many other things, and sometimes you could hardly see. You could hear about the Minamoto disease, polluting the water, polluting the air, and everything else. That was Japan's progress, so to say. I don't necessarily want to denigrate it. They have come along really miraculously, if I may say so, but it came with a price. And here is perhaps representations of an era wherein architecture was based on industrialization. That was the age of the 1960s, but the metabolism movement was in progress, emerged and in progress perhaps for about 10 years. The last remnant of that, which I'm very sorry about, is Kurokawa's Nakagin Capsule Tower, built in 1972, was just demolished a couple of years ago. So here it is, Kenzo Tange's Yamanashi building. It's an industrially produced building, very interesting. 16 shafts hold up an entire building. It's quite monumental building, so to say. You can see it on the other side, a co-worker of Kenzo Tange, Shinichi Okada, the new Supreme Court building in 1974 in Tokyo. These are large monumental buildings. So let's go on and see what this metabolism movement culminated in. And that was, well, the Osaka Expo of 1970. It was a very well-known, Japan was very proud of this industrial development and what they have achieved. And if you look at these buildings, and I am just showing Kenzo Tange's space frame, which was 300 meters long and 160 meters wide. Now, meters, what does that mean in feet, right? Because many of you are not very well aware of the metric system. 300 meters is roughly about 900 feet. 160 would be 500, okay? It's huge. And so you can see it, although these have been already demolished. So that was the demonstration of Japan's achieving an industrial process, which was reflected also in architecture. The new expo next year will have a completely different theme, but more about that later on. Then, of course, came the bubble economy. That was when the economy ran amok. In 1985, started in Japan, the land prices increased and so many, and that coincided with postmodernism in Japan. Anything could go because there was money for everything. It was a bubble economy. Let me give you just one example. In Ginza, Yonchome, which is central, 1 square foot of land, 1 square foot of land sold $24,500 US equivalent. Now, if that's the case and taxation was paid after that, of course, they had to build on that land as soon as possible so that they would be able to pay the tax. Now, so that was money at that time, everything speculation, land speculation, and so on. And here we are looking at, well, at least some of them, foreigners coming to Japan, and Japan, like China at that time, became the playground of architects. And you can see Philip Stark. It's a bubble, literally. And then here, Brandon Coates, it's a stage architecture. Or the Japanese Shin Takamatsu. I don't know if the name is familiar to you. This one is a building. I can't talk too much about it, but it's a particular scale. And interestingly enough, I was very sorry when this was demolished 21 years after it was built. This is Japan. Buildings are built and pulled down. And that's also related to the land price and the renewal now. So let's go on. At the same time, in the bubble economy, in this frenzy of building and construction, take a look at what happened to the land. This is on Awaji Island, which is across Osaka Bay, wherein the new airport was built and designed by, well, who else? Renzo Piano. Perhaps you are familiar with the project. But that was built in the sea, some 5 kilometers, which would be about 3 miles in the sea, 30-meter deep, 900 feet deep water. A lot of land had to be carved away from the land. And that was where the land was carved, like this. So here is, again, the repercussion or the backlash of that development, which then came along with the bubble economy. More about that later on. But, so why I am titling this presentation to you as returning to nature? Because Japan, as you can see, is the land of the rising sun. Japan, or Japan as a land and as a nation, derives itself in mythology, even today, from nature. And the highest authority in that is Amaterasu Omikami, the sun, oops, I'm going the wrong way, of the sun goddess. But Shinto imagines every phenomenon in the world as inhabited with spiritual entities which are called kami. So all in this world of the Japanese and Japanese architecture way back in history, nature played a very, very significant role. And of course, it reflected also in architecture. Let me see if I push the right button here. And here is the Issa shrine, which is the most sacred one dedicated to the sun goddess. Every 20 years, it's rebuilt. This is a very interesting subject, which I cannot get into. It is the renewal of the land, renewal of the time, the eternal return, about which Mircea Eliade wrote a wonderful book, well, The Eternal Return. There's a religious scholar. But it is worshipped. As you can see, people are dedicating themselves. These are sacred trees. The trees have been always sacred in Japan. And here are the latest one, which I witnessed in 2013, when people come here and bow, paying respect to, well, the origin of the land, of the nature, or and the nation as well. Let's go on. And of course, all of these festivals in Japan, when it comes to cherry blossoms, for about 1 week, and people go out into nature to experience this fantastic white cloud, the natural, and it's indeed intoxicating, I would have to say literally as well. They drink as much sake as they can have, and they sleep out there and so on. But this is a communion, even today, of the Japanese with nature. So, and then of course, there is the architecture, the tea house in particular, which is integrated into the garden and such, disappears as a meditative place wherein you drink tea. And it has a long history. This is related to Zen, which I cannot go back, but simply I am mentioning this to you, that the role of architecture within nature has been an equivalent on two sides, meaning architecture does not dominate nature. This is not the Versailles Palace. This is a humble architecture and much which comes down in the history. And here is Katsura Villa. Excuse me. I am sometimes losing my voice. Hope not this time. This is where I would call this, and as this is a prototype for many architects, Kenzo Tange was one of those, Kengo Kuma is, and so many architects go back to, this is not the one and only, but this is perhaps the best known. It is built in the 16th century for about 100 years, incrementally. And I would call this is perhaps architecture as landscape. I will be a little bit more specific about later on. Here is the little example. There was a private residence who was Ishikawa Jozan, a poet who lived in Tokyo, and then he built this residence for himself. It's still available. And then you can see when the moving walls, the fusuma and the shoji, these translucent wall panels are removed. There is this immediate reunion with, well, the inside and outside, with architecture as man-made and nature as such. Not just outside. Every single material here in this building is natural, is wood. The tatami is rice, straw, and so many other things. And of course, that is something what the Japanese believe in this case, they living still in the nature. Let's go on. Here are examples how they mediate between interior and exterior, when in nature is represented here as an abstract landscape, the dry garden in case of Nanzenji from 1611, and take a look at these layered zones, how they mediate between outside and inside, or nature and artifice. These are simply examples and very limited quite clearly, but something which I would refer back to when talking about contemporary scenario, or the pocket gardens, which are, very often in Japan in the history, as you can see, within the fabric of building, there are these little islands, very tiny ones. And if you look at the name of the household, oops, wrong button again. It's called kate, which is the combination of the ie, or ka in case, and the te, which is the garden. Kate is the household, inseparably between the building and these small pocket gardens. Okay, so let's go on. And I'd like to now jump and review some of those strategies which are emerged, and even today, perhaps it's safe to say, run today parallel. How they try to reconnect. And this is, again, perhaps from 1970, exactly at the time when the industrialization showed up its dark side, wherein the pollution was all around, the environment was literally destroyed. So let's go back. This is Osaka, and the photograph is taken from a helicopter when Ando, and I and many others flew over Osaka and see many of his buildings from the air. And this is what in 1974, how Osaka, or a part of it, looked like. You have already seen Tokyo, which was a little bit more recent photograph, but this goes back. It's very dense and very rare to see, oops, now wrong again. Nature, take a look at this. Nature is squeezed out in this setup. So Ando comes along in 1969 when he establishes his office, and his first more significant, major is not necessarily size, but this is a significant building. And this one is the row house in Subiyoshi of 1976. A very tiny building, which, as you can see on the plan and the photograph, turns its back to this alienating environment. The noise, the bleached out nature, and tries to inside capture whatever nature can present. And that happens in this courtyard. It's a very tiny residence. It's not more than 12, 13 feet wide and 5 times longer. And so here is this building, reinforced concrete, with which he works and has been working ever since, rejecting the city as such, which is alienating the residents. Privacy is, again, compromised. So he turns his attention to that miniature little courtyard. Again, here we are, which is open to the sky. And if you go from one side to the other side, you have to cross this, which means from the bedroom to the bathroom, you have to go outside. The rain is there and the sky. It's yours. And so is the shadows what it casts. The Koshino residence, which I have shown in 1981, 82, is one of the examples how he responds to natural phenomena, bringing it in to the fabric of the building. It works as a beam and the shadow of it like a sundial. And so when we photographed it, it takes time. It moves, it emerges, fades away, and then eventually like a light, oops, I have to get used to it. Like a lightsaber also appears. It's a little theater. And it's just for a short time. Then it, of course, fades. But it highlights the surface of the concrete, as you can see, becomes a topography. Let's go on. And this is what he said, and I think it is part of this charrette with which I have started out. And I do not believe architecture should speak too much. It should remain silent and let nature in the guise of sunlight and wind speak. Wind and rain are equally transformed by the seasonal change. They can be chilling or gentle and pleasant. They activate space, make us aware of the season, and nurture within us a finer sensitivity. This is what he's believed. This is his credo. Ars Poetica, if one wants to say that. And so he continues along this line, even today, although he has now an international practice, wherein sometimes these issues are not as prevalent as perhaps in some of his smaller buildings. But here is this in Kyoto, 1984, and an addition to it, 1994. A beautiful little building along the Takase River. It's a very tiny one. How he relates to this quiet environment in the hustle bustle of the city and captures it, introduces it inside the building. This is how it is in the evening, and you can see these walls and the porous quality of this fabric or building itself as it penetrates. And of course, there is a small, tiny courtyard in there as well. Let's go on. This is one of the latest one. It's as 19, one of the latest ones. It's a children's, well, not museum, it's a library. Again, along, well, the major river in Osaka. It's a beautiful small building. I don't know if I have any interior photos of this, no, but remains to be seen and said that this is one of those buildings wherein how he opens the building toward and how you approach it toward the river. You have to climb up the stairs and then the river is revealed. It's again this kind of anticipation. You have seen the river, but it is introduced in a different way. Openings and shuffling walls, what he's an artist about. It introduces, well, let's remain with that, nature in a particular way, because the instrument through which you observe reality, or in particular case nature, it alters it. It introduces a different facet, a different meaning to it. And architecture can play a role in that. And Ando started that quite early. So what about today? This is, today Ando is 83 years old. Well, there is a new generation or generations who are working in many genres of architecture. And I'd like to say a few words about that. I let the cat out of the sack. And that one is much quieter, simpler, lighter, unostentatious, less ego-driven. Do you know the star architects all around, the big shots? This is not what it is today. And it intends to be more part of the environment or nature. And here are just flashing up, there are many. Atelier Bawao, Tezuka Architects, Kengo Kuma, Shigeru Ban, and Kazuyo Sejima, or even SANAA, as she is part of that partnership. Yoshio Taniguchi, who is, by the way, also the architect of the MoMA in New York, has designed beautiful, absolutely beautiful buildings. Simple, minimalist, but extremely rich in experience and architecture. This one is dedicated to Daisetsu Suzuki, who was a Zen Buddhist scholar, published many books on Zen, and of course he died. And then this is a memorial. It's a small meditation pavilion, if you will, and it's in this shallow pool of reflecting water. That's the plan. You can see this building. It's just a simple cube, if you will, with three openings. One is the entrance, and the other one is looking at this pool. I don't show it here, unfortunately, in this bed, but there is here at this point, where is that? Let me, there, oh, here, when a small bubble comes up and then creates the ripples of water, just when you drop a stone into the water, and then you watch this every 5 minutes. It comes with a sound, and then this fading ripples of, well, little waves. A beautiful building. Here is another view, and somebody is right there looking at it, waiting. I have many photos of that, and I have to take the blame. I did not bring in when the ripples, but please imagine that. I trust your imagination. Now, we are talking about schools, and that is very important in Japan. These schools are not a school what you attend here. These are generations, or how would I say that, is genealogy by way of association, wherein a master architect works and his disciples continue the work while at the same time modify that. And we can identify a number of these. This is typically, perhaps I would call Asian, but also in Japanese, very importantly. And the first one is Terunobu Fujimori, an architect and historian, theoretician, introduced these names, the White School, and then so on. This is an absolutely minimalist architecture with very little footprint on the ground, perhaps by default. And this one is a house in in Tokyo by Su Fujimoto. By the way, Su Fujimoto is the designer of the new Osaka Expo, that big ring, which I will show you in a bit. And in MoMA, in 2016, there was an exhibition of this White School. It was basically the initiative of Kazuo Shinohara. He was a very influential one. Toyo Ito was one of those who admired his work. I am not showing Shinohara, but Toyo Ito, both as a disciple and a very influential architect, well, has his constellation, as they called. SANAA is part of it, Sejima is part of it, and so many others, Fujimoto included. This was an exhibition in MoMA. And here is Toyo Ito, Sejima there, with, of course, Peter Eisenman at that time in MoMA. I don't know if anybody has seen that exhibition. Here is Toyo Ito in his own house, which is in 1984, which is called the Silver Hut, Going Back Hut. The name itself, silver, is technological or contemporary, whereas the hut refers back to a previous kind of living. And as you can see, both the photograph and the diagrams is a very minimalist approach to architecture, very light, and unfortunately it's already gone. But became very important and very influential. Here is his more contemporary, in 2000, famous Sendai Mediatek. We have seen Kenzo Tange's Kofu building, the Yamanashi, with the 16 reinforced concrete, huge and monumental. This has 13 lacy shafts supporting the entire building and in an irregular display. Why? Because there are no diagonal bracing in this building. The shafts itself are the ones, because of their form, provides the lateral resistance to move and to what? Earthquakes. And that happened in 2011 and the building survived. So here it is, that is that light fluid space. Can't go much into it, but very influential building. SANAA, Sejima was working for Toyo Ito and established her office and eventually recruited another Ito employee, Ryuen Nishizawa, who is 10 years younger than she is. And then when comes the larger project, this one is one of the famous one, the first SANAA building. SANAA is Sejima and Nishizawa Architects Associate, if you want to know. So there are two in there. This is that what represents this white architecture. What is that? Minimal material entity. Almost everything is steel, very thin posts, about 4 or 5 inches diameter. And everything is painted white. It is literally the dematerialization of architecture. As you can see, it's almost a sensory deprivation, sort of. And here is the diagram wherein what? In this huge circle inserted little pots or special places, spaces within that. This is a diagram, by the way, which comes down from Kenzo Tange by way of Ito, those shafts, and here they become independent spaces and open courtyards. And as you will see it even on that, that is the photograph about that. Here is the view of one of these courtyards, and we are referring back to this inserted little gaps, vacuums, rich in nature, but and enriching architecture. And here is that very close by, at least here in the US, it's in Toledo, Ohio, the glass pavilion. Take a look at this. Again, it's surrounded by a huge glass wall, and within that, many of the individual spaces are also glass, not all, but many of them. And then here you have, again, the courtyards. It's a very, very interesting building. Anybody who wants to know more about it can go and see it and learn about it. Here is that wherein, well, basically no visual perimeter or obstruction as between outside and inside, or in this case, the park and the building itself. Going back to, well, this one, and these are just selected examples, but there are many in Japan. Now, we are looking at, in Switzerland, Lucerne, which is a large building, and it's an undulating one. A very unique topography, particularly inside, because there are no partitions, but there are islands. As you can see, this is the plan, and you can see the courtyards here punctuated like what? The Swiss cheese, right? Emmentaler. And then, I'm not saying that they went after the cheese, no. I think this is relates back to their own spatial organization, if you will. And so here is this building. You can criticize this. It's fantastic inside. It's a landscape. You might even call a garden inside, which I will perhaps momentarily show. But it's quite a bit of an object at the same time in this landscape. It's carved out with quite a bit of presence and has been criticized by quite many as contextually not exactly fit in this landscape. Even the underside of this undulating work here is a little bit empty at the moment. So there is no green area. Now it's improving in Nishizawa's work. When we go to the Senju Museum, the same paradigm, as you can see, is up here. The courtyard is a very interesting one. It's still undulating, both roof and floor, and the courtyard includes green. Here is Su Fujimoto, who is in the House of Hungarian Music, very recent building, incorporates, well, again, the openings wherein trees go through, and the ceiling here, anodized aluminum colored, reflects or alludes to the foliage of trees in the fall. The photograph was taken in the winter. This is what is inside. This is the section of the building. It's a very interesting one. Here it is in summer. How to incorporate. And the interesting thing in here, there were existing trees. He designed the building in a way that many of these openings coincided with the trees, saving the trees as they were. Okay. Now, here is perhaps an absolute minimalist building from this white school. This is Junya Ishigami, who comes out in this white school from Sejima's office, right? Again, master, disciple who turns into master. And this is Junya Ishigami designing this workshop in Kanagawa Institute of Technology. What is this building? It's a glass enclosure, not exactly rectangular, and 305 steel posts. That's it. 305 white steel posts. And that's an analogy of the forest. Nothing else. No bathroom, no toilets. If you have to run for your life, it's the next building. Sorry. Now, it's hard to imagine a more minimalist building like this. Yes, you can subject it to criticism, no question about it. Most buildings are not built like this. But there is an interesting one here. It is speculating about how far you can conceive architecture as, how would I say that, immaterial conception of architecture. Have we talked about this today? What we have been talking about, this phenomena, is all immaterial. Or is light material? Yes. Is shadow material? Is it an element? Yes. Now, so here it is. And then let's go to Kengo Kuma. He has eventually turned into the champion and perhaps the leader of the Red School. And why the Red School? Because he works with as many materials and typically with natural materials as possible. This is completely the opposite of the white school, wherein the materials are reduced to absolute minimum. Everything is white. Well, we are changing, as we will see, there is a kind of blending together the two. But here it is, the Red School, because they work with natural materials, Kuma and many others in his school. The first thing here is to save nature is the Kirosan Observatory. Rather than put something onto an already erased flat land, he inserts the little observation and just two little platforms extend out there. So that's one, involving the earth, moving into the earth. Or in this case, the Kitakami Canal Museum Edition is under the bank of this canal. So you can move over that. It's literally perhaps underneath in this case. Here is Tadao Ando. He is never really far from any of these issues. This is remarkable on his part. This one is the Chichu Museum, which literally means Chichu under the ground. This is a museum. You can see it on this remote photograph. Almost nothing sticks out of the land. He protects it. And then everything is inlaid into the ground with, sunken courtyards and so on. Junya Ishigami. Here is a residence and the small restaurants carved into the land like a cave. You can see it, how he carved it, the flat rooftop, which is white in this case, well, white school, right? But underneath it is this well-reinforced concrete, reinforced and so on. Very interesting how he went by the design. It was designed by, it was built while it was built. So here it is, an underground building. Back to Kengo Kuma and working with glass and water. This is an early building by him, 1995, glass house in Atame. It is indeed a little bit similar to what Sejima and SANAA have been doing. But who then deviates from that? He discovered in that place that how certain louver systems cast shadow and the ripple of the water. So what he does here is literally fragments the material and slats covered like the back of this auditorium here. And he refers back to some precedents in Japanese art. And this one is a very simple museum, one story dedicated to Ando Hiroshige, who was what? A wood block print artist of the 19th century, early 19th century. So many of his prints are displayed in his case. What is interesting, the building is also carved through like a tunnel, provides a destination toward the Shinto shrine, which is behind. So what is this? It is an architecture which breaks down the material entity into smaller elements. You might even call it fragments. It's like a pointillism in painting, and in this case, it's Georges Seurat of one painting. This is using the material in one particular way. And he goes back to some of these precedents. This is Hiroshige's work, wherein he shows the rain coming down, in this case with vertical lines. That happens, well, not necessarily by relationship between the two. In the Kusakaba residence, you can see this facade, which is really not a flat one, but it's within this relatively shallow dimension is quite richly layered. And then you can see now the reference, how it is echoed within Kuma's building. Now here is another building, but perhaps a little bit more, close maybe 14 years ago. That one is the Yusuhara Wooden Bridge Museum. So the bridge itself, which you can see right here, is a museum. It's a landscape, very steeply sloping and so on. It connects to the bathhouse, which is right here. It's not his design. But he was commissioned, this is a little bit of an artist residence, and then this one is the museum. But take a look at this one, what it is. Here we are, this is the section of the museum here. What you can see, then that's the museum, is highly elevated above the ground. And these are the Todaiji, the big Buddhist temple in Nara, from 1750, or 752, sorry about that. And this is the section of that. You can perhaps identify certain kind of reference. Who did that too? It was in the metabolist movement, Isozaki, who was very similar in that case in a large scale, urban scale. But there is no time to talk about this. A meditation chapel of wood. Here you can again experience what material and these smaller facets of wood plates have this, he sometimes refers to as fog or clouds or a screen. That's perhaps the most architectural termination for that. of this little, out in the German woods. It's very close to Munich. Now we are going back to it because he uses this material as a zone, wherein the partition or the demarcation of the building is problematized. It's not sharply inscribed. So that is his goal, to remove architecture from its typically understood object-like quality, to disperse it, well, just like the pointillism in paintings. Now we are going back to this example wherein this layering, problematizing the demarcation of the, the area between outside and inside and so on. That is one of his strategies. Here it is, this reverts back to, this one is the facade and the structure of this very small building. And this is called the Jigoku Gume. This is a joinery in architecture, which is coming from old times. It's not very easy to put together. And picture this, how you design this. It is impossible without the craftsman who can do this. And so he relies on these people who are typically living in the place or perhaps even invited to do this work. And that is remarkable. And this is also structural. You can see it on the little diagram, inside, outside there, and this is the building. It's a small confectionery shop where they produce it. Go there if you can, delicious, I can guarantee. You will not go wrong. It's in Tokyo. Okay. So, and this is what Kuma tells us, well, if not exactly today, but it is relevant for today. What people need in our time is not something with an interesting, or perhaps I would add to it, spectacular form, but something which is in harmony with the forest, harmony with nature. So in variety of ways, oops, I'm going back, do I? Momentarily I did. But here is the next one. This one is a small history museum. Take a look at the dry reeds woven into a steel mesh, providing a screen through which you can see, but not everything. And that's the art of Japanese architecture. This is a chocolatier in Paris, wherein he has, well, dry wooden branches as the interior. It's a very tiny space, that's all. And of course, great chocolate. Here is the lotus house. Lotus, why? Because that is a lotus flower. That's the symbol of Buddhism and wisdom. And this is a curtain here by travertine pieces of stone. It is like a curtain. It's anchored to the water, but when wind comes along, it moves. And this provides this kind of filter. Light, wind, and all of those light and shadow come into play in this private residence. A larger one here, it's in China, it's the pot mixed with wood and so on. I don't go into much detail. The same thing. This is a huge industrial or office park. Now, here is an example. This is again not a building, but it's an architecture. It's in Aix-en-Provence, in France, south, wherein the long story, these are little polys, if that's the good word for that. And he is putting together again something on the right side, which is capturing the shadow and light. And he refers to komorebi, which is the sun shines through the foliage of a tree. And you have experienced that, right? So he tries to do something with architecture in that regard. Now here is his very famous Nazim Art Museum, going back to almost vernacular in a beautiful garden. But the reason I am showing this to you is not just in its relationship, but I will point out to you this passage. You enter here, not here. Eventually, that's the entry point. But he takes you on a journey. And that journey is worthwhile. In fact, in Japanese architecture, the approach or the journey is as important and as significant as the arrival. And when you go to the Shinto shrine, the Ise, and many others, you can't even enter. And that's the interesting thing about many of these pieces of architecture. You enter the architecture in terms of imagination. You arrive at it and you transform the place of entry. But how you get there is very important. So here it is, this miniature passage. This is, of course, indeed a harvested bamboo. And the real one is on the right side. Take a look at how it is lit, how you walk on that, and there is this pebbled floor outside. Before you turn around the corner and you will discover the entry, and then you enter the building. All bamboo, the panels on the roof or the ceiling, in other words, are all of bamboo. And here, as we are looking out, all Chinese pieces of art are displayed in his case. Now, going back to perhaps a little bit earlier, we talked about that he uses as many different materials as exist, particularly on the site. And this one is mud, or they call it, well, adobe, as we do too. And here he builds with this one and brings his architecture close to what I would call the vernacular. This vernacular is something which transcends perhaps sometimes even cultures. The Yusuhara Marché, that's a small hotel and a marketplace inside. Take a look at this openable louver system, which is completely of thatch, which is very, very common, certainly in historic architecture in Japan, because rice is all around the place, and they used it for the cover of shrines and buildings and so on, private residences included. But what is important in this case is that this is not a permanent material. It weathers, and then you have to replace it. Architecture in Japan has been constantly replacing, renew it, because they were fragile. And here is the section, and that's how it looks inside. A museum with charred cedar. That's, again, with a pitched roof. Do you remember the modern architecture when pitched roof was the arch enemy, right? That was no way that you could do. This is contemporary, and I maintain that contemporary and then extremely rich in many ways. I can perhaps, well, tell you and you believe me, but since you haven't been there, water, wood, and spaces within merged with the nature. This is how you look at this mountain, and the rooftop here, there is a flat one, is a rock garden. A disciple, because this is also a school. Hiroshi Nakamura comes from his office, and he does this little restaurant and the kitchen in the country up in the mountains, all of the Japanese cedar. And there is a hot spring there. Well, you can stick your feet into that hot water there and savor the moment, right? You can see it right there. Japan is full of hot springs because of the volcanic nature. This is Koichi Yasuda, a small museum in Kyoto. Take a look at this again, the marriage of architecture and nature. This is how you look at it from outside. That's a diagram. Hiroshi Sambui. He spends a lot of time in investigating the land. And I go back to here, how he continues the land. He shapes, of course, both the land and the roof of the architecture. Here, the roof is, as you can see, is continuous with the land. So I would go back to the issue that architecture as landscape in this particular case And Sambuichi is now coming up right here, going back to Katsura in some sense reflects the same ideas. Here is Kengo Kuma, the Portland Cultural Village. It's a complex, several buildings, how it is integrated into the land of the garden. If you haven't been to Portland, Oregon, I would recommend that you do. It's a beautiful Japanese garden. Some 50-some years ago, Japanese gardeners created it with the Americans, and now it has expanded. And Kuma, with the help of my son, designed this complex here, and I'd like to introduce this. How architecture can recede literally and take not the primary role. You don't confront architecture in Japan, certainly not historically, like in France. This is not a monumental building. This is serene, quiet, and very rewarding. So this is what happens in case of nature and architecture. Here is the plan. Take a look at how it zigzags. This is the flying geese, as it is called in Japan. Katsura Villa is right there. Kuma's favorite example. Here are examples, additional photographs of this complex. And now here we go. This is Kuma in China, blending architecture, climbing up on the steep hill, and the roofs. And the roofs here are all recycled tiles. Demolished buildings he harvested from this, went around, and used them to cover his pitched roof all around. Recycling. Now, here it is. So what is the nature of nature? One can ask, and why not? In pristine nature, everything is recycled. The problem comes when humans enter nature. And that's a problem. And architecture plays a role in that, not just in destroying the environment, but perhaps redeeming it. And so here are what we may rethink, reuse, recycle, and repair. Architecture with nature, or nature with architecture. This is a by-way, two-way street. So let's see, Ando. Do you remember that one? Repairing, renovating that. Ando has designed here a large garden with buildings and so on. That's the Yumebutai, which is the stage of dreams. That is his dream. By the way, Ando, not just as an architect, but after the earthquakes, which are very devastating in Japan, he went out and planted with his own cost 10,000 trees. Is this architecture? You bet. It has something to do with it. So he puts his money where his belief is. But this is only part of it. Now, here is after the earthquake. This is Kengo Kuma, rebuilding communities with very simple buildings to give back the livelihood. In fact, planting trees was not just a gesture to, well, bring up green architecture, but by the people who planted these trees, brought the community, the hardly traumatized, deeply traumatized community together to plant trees. Now, here is Shigeru Ban, an Pritzker Prize-winning architect, who when in New Zealand, in Christchurch, destroyed the cathedral, and he built very frequently or fast with this, call them paper tubes, but they are actually not really paper, this cathedral. I went there to see how this is. Actually, it's much more impressive to me than I would have imagined that. Light comes in here, it's quite remarkable. And I talked to the people there, they like it so much that although initially a temporary building as it was built, it is now retained as a permanent, even though the old cathedral is being rebuilt. So here are a few examples, and I have to go fast because so is time passing fast. A few buildings wherein Kuma has reused material, like in this case, Masanari Murai was a very famous Japanese painter that studied and worked in Paris, and this was his residence, but they wanted to turn it into a little gallery. So he redesigned it by reuse the material. So this is all coming from the old material. And part of that old house is right now here within the new building, the old and the new. Let's go and fast go. Another one here by, again, Hiroshi Nakamura. Why is this building interesting? It's a brewery, very good micro brewery of beer. Good beer. But take a look at this facade here. Inside and outside. This is all recovered windows from old demolished buildings. So it's like, how would one say, a tapestry or a puzzle put together, but it has its own charm, and it saved some material into old, directed into the new one. Here, Kuma renovates an old Chinese type of architecture, which is the hutong in China, is known, and this is his Chinese office in Beijing. He does that. Here is the plan of this with the courtyard. The hutong was always, like in many in Japan, across or around a small courtyard. This is how you get in there. And the louver system here is aluminum. In France, in the art in Besançon, you know Besançon, this Victor Hugo's birthplace, and there is this old building along the river. Oops, it was a bar. He turned it into the core of his museum, and the music school is next to it. So at the same time, in between the two, he opens a space, a passage, which is a continuation of the the road, and it directly leads like a gateway toward the river. This is how the roofscape is. This is the old building, as now is turned into the museum, and then the new, which is wood. The old building is brick with concrete floor. And perhaps the last but one, if I remember, bear with me, is a large shipyard. The Russians or the Soviets gave it to China in the early 1950s to build ships in the river, the Hangpu River, and this is under construction. And commissioned Kuma, and he readily took it to save the building as much as possible, to turn it into a cultural and commercial center. So here it is. Let's take a few cursory look at it. This is while it's under construction, and this is the new one. You can clearly see this old industrial structure, which is brutish, the Botond Bognar, and so on. And now is combined, contrasted with this much more delicate materials and spaces, a very powerful building in many ways. Here are some additional photographs, and that is now the rebuilt one, and this is one place wherein pieces of art are displayed. And this is the last one, if I am correct. I know to be one who shows a lot of photos. So hang in there, the end is close. Now, here is this building, which is in, again, in Kanazawa. We have seen it, and many architects, Taniguchi, SANAA, and so on. And here is Kuma, rebuilding an old building which is by and large remains as was from outside, but it was derelict and needed to be, well, revived. And so Kuma goes in there, and rather than concrete, by the way, you may know, and it's generally widely known, Kuma and Ando, even though they are both brilliant architects, they don't see eye to eye. And why? Because Kuma does not like concrete, even though he has to use it because that's architecture in some sense. But as much as possible, he uses wood, and he uses it in a particular way with local labor or craftsmanship, local materials, and respecting the spatial configuration and so on of the architecture. This is the Yoshijima house. As you can see, the woodwork or the roof work of this beautiful residence. And this is what he has done completely new inside the building. These are additional 2 photos, and I believe the last 2 you will see here. And so I would have to say thank you for your patience that you were sticking around here. And I just hope you have learned something about this architecture or the potential of architecture, what it can and perhaps should do. Because architecture is not just an object dropped down on a place or a site place. It can be so much more in the human experience if you are sensitive enough to know what it can do. It makes your architecture much richer. And I am now sorry that I am not showing you the latest Ando building, which about a week ago I saw in Melbourne, Australia. It's a small meditation pavilion. But go to the internet and see it. It's a minimalist architecture, but extremely rich. Minimalism, if you do it well, is not the elimination of experience, but the condensation. It is bringing it together, but you have to have the patience, the time, and I would call this Kuma's, Ando's, and many a slow time architecture. It doesn't reveal as a spectacle immediately, and you can go back, wow. You have to take your time. You have to discover it. Take your time, both in designing and when you go out experiencing. Thanks so much, guys.
There's a couple of minutes here for questions. Who can I hand this to?
I took much of your time for questions, but I am okay. If you are fine, I am ready to talk about architecture. What is your question?
Hi, good evening. Thank you for your talk. It's great to have you here. My question is, I've heard this term metabolism, the metabolic movement.
Many of them have.
Could you explain a little bit more about what that means?
Well, it was a particular movement in Japan, started out in the 1960s. You see, that was an international, it's a long story, so I tried to condense it, okay? Wherein the Japanese, with this industrialization, came to the realization that architecture can be driven or based on industrial technology and construction. You have seen some of those. They also believe that the city is a movable or changing environment, wherein some of the elements, private residences or buildings, could be and will change. And so they try to devise urban schemata. Many of them remained on the drawing board or in models. Or what you have seen in some of these large buildings, or the Nakagin capsule tower, which was an entity, a building, a small city of 144 capsules based on shipping containers attached to the two vertical shafts. And the idea was, the shipping container, that you could remove, there were 4 bolts, and then the connections to the infrastructure, electricity, and so on, so that your unit could be plugged into, like your computer when it runs out of energy, right? So that was the idea, so that you could put your minimalist, existential minimalist, little 2x4, which is in metric system, and 2.4 by 3.6. That is a shipping container. And put it under the trailer, go to another place, but there are also these docks, vertical docks, and clip it on there. Didn't materialize. It remained frozen in time, and so many other things. The idea was valid, but society was certainly not ready for that. And by the time it reached the Osaka Expo 70, society moved on. And the society which was supposed to appreciate this became, at that time, the consumer society. So that these buildings, what the changeability was, something like a Toyota car. That was the price of one of these units. You could outfit it with any stereo or fabric and so many other things. So it entered the commercial world. And so what the initial idea was really watered down. Industrialization, like in so many countries, leading countries, if that's the good word, went out. Went to China, went to India, whatever you have, outsourcing. And that's now the trend, or is it? So that was the demise of metabolism. It was a very interesting one. What is remarkable in that Tokyo, as an environment, basically replicates the idea of metabolism. Buildings are demolished at a rate of unprecedented time and fast. And I know it, not because I go out there and see some, or I don't see them anymore, but because I write also about a guidebook, and I had to remove a large number of buildings out with it and replace new. This is an environment which turns around quite fast. Metabolism. And what is the interesting issue? The Isa Shrine, which is rebuilt every 20 years. It basically, I don't necessarily want to identify these two trends, that why buildings are demolished and rebuilt new. One is a ritual one, but it's somewhat in the DNA of the Japanese culture, if not every individual, that the environment is a fluid, is a movable, just like what nature is all about. You cannot capture. I don't know, when I was a student of architecture and practicing architecture in the modern era, the 1960s, 70s, we thought that our buildings were there for the entirety of time, all the way. That's not the case, particularly not in Japan. But many contemporary forces dictate this change. And I have already referred to that, the land prices, which dictate that at that time, a building what you could build on that land, wherein 1 square foot was $24.5 thousand US, a building could be 1/10 of the price of the land. Now, you are in the commercial world. You compete with your, well, fellow citizens or, merchants and so on. You have to be like a salesman. If you don't have a new car, forget about your business, right? So they had to rebuild. That is part of it. But this is a complex issue. Metabolists put a finger on the pulse of this. They missed it somehow, but the city, even today, replicates this, or perhaps that's where it comes from. If you are interested in, there is a book in which I contributed, was published by in London, Routledge, and it's a very complicated, long story, but metabolism and its urban architecture. What I was writing about that, how this changeability turned into a sort of formalism, wherein effective change was just simply flashed up, like in case of the Nakagin capsule tower. Charles Jenks wrote about it. It implies a temporality aesthetically and in many ways, and particularly in construction. 4 bolts, it never happened. But the city changes in an unprecedented way. If you want to hear more about metabolism, we could discuss that, but I think time is running short, and perhaps we have some other questions. If we do, don't feel intimidated. I am ready unless your boss, Mohammed, says, that's it, guys. And then we have to finish.
Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. My question is brief. 21 years ago, when I was in Aomori, I visited the community center designed by Kisho Kurokawa. And I ended up talking to some people, the community members, who were telling me about the resistance to that building and the fact that they really wanted to have Ando design that building. So what do you think about communities' involvement in the design of projects in Japan? And I know that's a very broad, general question, but
all right. How long time do you have?
2 minutes.
Okay. The relationship between an architect and the construction industry and the client are completely different in Japan than it is here in the US. The construction company and the architect work hand in hand. They are not in antagonistic relation. They don't litigate each other. And they work to the best interest of the building, or should I say the architecture. The architect has an on-site representative who guides the work, lives there. Now, the other one is the client. Now, we are talking about a private, of course, construction in this case. If they know the architect and trust the work, they know it. I can have many stories about Ando. I was there when Ando was nowhere to be known. And we went around his small, tiny buildings in the early 70s. And I went to photographs and see the buildings. He had lots of time on his hand. He had 4 people in his office. And so all of a sudden I see a lot of middle-aged, what Japanese call obasan, women. You know, so I asked Ando-san, who are these here? I'm trying to forget. He said, these are my future clients. He brought along, like an open house, people who were interested in his buildings and showed them. Now, there is another one today, like Itsuko Hasegawa, another architect coming from the Shinohara school. I haven't shown female architect, very few female architects in Japan. It's growing, but far from being enough. But she's one of them. So she organizes, when she designed a large children's museum, the entire community. She proposed certain ideas, sketches, models, and asked what the community was thinking about it. And she implemented many. Of course, those people are not architects, but they can voice what they are interested in, particularly many children. I wouldn't necessarily say that this is a common practice in Japan, but the client typically trusts the architects and leaves the work to him or her. That is a very interesting social, how would one say, relationship between you trust. You were introduced somewhere. a gaijin in Japan is the outsider. If you are introduced by somebody, you are immediately part of that circle of which the architect is. So if you trust, you were introduced and you know the work, the clients trust. I know Nick and Seke, a large company, many governmental agencies give the work because they know. And then when they know the work, they say, this is it, you do it. And they say, you do the best job. That's a little bit simplification, but yes, generally it is like that. It was not 2 seconds, but at least not a couple of hours.
I think we do have to leave it there. But thank you so much, first of all, for sharing your expertise through this lecture, but then also, of course, spending time with our 403 students and charrette that you devised. It was super productive and a great way to touch in with our community. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the time, the opportunity to chit chat about architecture, which is my favorite subject, quite clearly. And I am very pleased to meet you here and wish you very, very well in your future endeavor. Keep at it. Cheers. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes.
I'm working on a project. And I was wondering if you can have
Yes.
I currently have this.
Kiyoshi Seike was a professor I worked with when I was in Tokyo. He published the book on Japanese joinery.